Добрый вечер.
Good evening.
Может быть, вы расскажете, какие темы вы обсуждали наиболее подробно? Вот, в частности, очень интересует украинская тематика, в каком контексте она затрагивалась, обсуждалась ли?
Particularly the Ukrainian issue. Did you talk about the Donbass? Did you talk about the accession of Ukraine to NATO? And what about the expected return of the two ambassadors to their posts? What decisions were made and what kind of discussion did you have? Well, as far as the reinstatement of the ambassadors are concerned,
we've reached an agreement that this issue will be resolved. They will be returning to service, their permanent service, but when specifically it'll be tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, that's a mere technical issue. We've reached an agreement that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia and the U.S. State Department would begin consultations on the full range of interaction on the diplomatic track. There are many things that remain to be resolved, but both sides, including the Americans, are geared toward finding a solution. Turning now to Ukraine, yes, this issue was discussed. I can't say it was discussed in detail, but as far as I've understood President Biden, he agrees that the basis for a settlement in Ukraine, the basis needs to be the Minsk agreements. As for the entry by Ukraine into NATO, this issue was broached. That remains to be discussed. That is what that's the general line. Question from Itar Tas. Mr. Putin, you said that one of the topics was strategic stability. Could you give us some more details about decisions, the decisions on this matter that Russia and the U.S. will be resuming, or will there be talks on strategic stability and disarmament, specifically regarding the START 3 treaty? Have you planned to start talks on its extension? Maybe there are some parameters or there are some new agreements to be signed. The United States and the Russian Federation have particular responsibility when it comes to strategic stability in the world. This is because we are the two largest nuclear powers, and we have the largest stockpiles of warheads and delivery systems based on the levels and based on the quality of modern nuclear weapons. We acknowledge this responsibility. I think it's clear for everyone the fact that President Biden has taken on responsibility and has taken the decision, which we believe is quite timely, to extend the START treaty for 5 years up until 2024. Of course, no doubt, the question remains on what happens next. We've reached an agreement that consultations will be commenced at the interagency level under the aegis of the State Department of the United States and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia. Our colleagues at the working level will set out the composition of the delegations and the place where they'll be working and how frequently such meetings will take place. Please, let's give the floor to a foreign journalist, CNN.
Hi, Matthew Chance from CNN. Thank you very much for giving me this question. First of all, could you characterize the dynamic between yourself and President Biden? Was it hostile or was it friendly? And secondly, throughout these conversations, did you commit to ceasing carrying out cyber attacks on the United States? Did you commit to stopping threatening Ukraine's security? And did you commit to stop cracking down on the opposition in Russia?
As for the first general appraisal, I think there was no hostility, quite the contrary. Our meeting took place, principally speaking, many of our positions. We don't share the same positions in many areas, but I think that both of these sides showed a willingness to understand one another and to find ways to bring our positions closer together. The talks were quite constructive. As for cybersecurity, we reached an agreement, chiefly that we will start negotiations on that. I think that's extremely important. Now, as for who needs to take on any sort of commitment, I'd like to inform you of something. I'm talking about something that's already well known, but not known to the broader public. Not from American sources. I'm afraid that I'll confuse the names of organizations, but as for American sources, they've said that most of the cyber attacks in the world are carried out from the cyber realm of the United States. In second place is Canada. Afterwards, Latin American countries, and then comes Great Britain. Russia on this list. Where's Russia on this list? Well, we are a country whose cyber territory has the most. Russia's not on the list. Number one. Secondly, we've received from the United States 10 requests regarding cyber attacks on attacks in the United States. As our colleagues have told us, they are from the cyber realm of Russia. And there were 2 requests this year. Both last year and this year, our colleagues have received exhaustive responses. For our part, Russia last year sent in accordance sent to the state structures of the U.S. over 40 and 35 this year, and we still haven't even received a single response on that front. This says that we do have something to work on. And the question of who, to what degree, needs to take on responsibility, that should be resolved during the negotiation process. We're going to start consultations. What we think is that when it comes to cybersecurity, cybersecurity is incredibly important in the world in general, and specifically for the United Nations, and it's also important for Russia to the same extent. I'll give you an example. We know that there were cyber attacks on a pipeline company in the United States. We also know that the company was compelled to pay $5 million to the blackmailers. Some of the money, I believe, has already been returned, according to my sources, which was paid electronically, but some of it has not been returned. And what do the state organs of Russia have to do with that? We are encountering the same threats. For example, when it comes to the healthcare system of one of the big regions of the Russian Federation. And we see that this work is being coordinated from the cyber realm of the United States. I don't think that the United States, that the official authorities have any interest in such types of manipulations. But I think just throwing out these insinuations at the expert level, that's inappropriate. We should sit and start working. That's in the interest of the United States and the Russian Federation. In principle, we've reached agreement about that, and Russia is prepared to do it. Let's continue. RT. RT. Give the microphone to RT, please. Please give the microphone to... Was some of the question not answered?
Thank you very much for coming back to us. So there were 2 other parts of the question. The first one is, did you commit in these meetings to stop threatening Ukraine? Remember, the reason this summit was called in the first place, or the timing of it, was when Russia was building up lots of forces across the border from Ukraine. And the second part of the question, the third part of the question, was, did you commit to stopping your crackdown against the opposition groups inside Russia led by Alexei Navalny?
So, I didn't hear that part of the question. Maybe it wasn't interpreted, or maybe you just decided to ask a second question. Let's turn now to commitments under the Ukraine. We only have one commitment, promoting the implementation of the Minsk agreements. If the Russian side is prepared to do it, then we will take that path without any doubt. Incidentally, I'd like to point out one point. Back in November of last year, what happened? The Ukrainian delegation submitted their considerations about how they are planning to implement the Minsk Accords. Please take a look. It's not a secret document. Here's what it says. Primarily, there's a need to have proposals for the political integration of Donbass into the Ukrainian legal system and constitution. To do that, there'll be a need for a constitutional amendment, as that's what it says, number one. And number two, the border between the Russian Federation and Ukraine along the line of Donbass will be occupied by the border forces of Ukraine on the day after the election. What did Ukraine propose? As a first step, returning the armed forces of Ukraine to their place of constant deployment. What does that mean? That means that the Ukrainian forces should go to Donbass. That's number one. The second thing that they proposed was closing the border between Russia and Ukraine in this area. And third, elections should be held in 3 months. In 3 months after these two steps are taken. You don't need to be an attorney. You don't need to have any special education to understand that that has nothing to do with the Minsk agreements. This runs fully counter to the Minsk agreements. That's why what additional commitments could Russia shoulder in this context? I think everything is understandable. Turning now to the exercises. We are conducting exercises on our own territory, just like the United States carries out exercises, a lot of exercises on their territory, but we didn't carry any exercises bringing our personnel and our equipment to the United States. Regrettably, the United States government is doing that right now. That's why the concerns should be not with Russia, but with the United States. But we talked about that during our talks. We clarified our positions. Turning now to the opposition and the citizen that you mentioned. Number one, this person knew that he was breaching the laws effective in Russia. He should have noted that as a person who was convicted 2 times. I'd like to underscore that he deliberately ignored the requirements of the laws. This person went abroad for treatment, and he didn't register with the authorities, and he came out of the hospital, and then he recorded a video, posting it in the internet. And then that requirement arrived. He didn't appear. He ignored the law, and he was then. He knew that he was then being investigated, and he came back deliberately. He did what he wanted to do. That's why. What can you say? As for people like him in the systemic opposition, regrettably the format of the press conference does not allow for us to get into this in depth, but here's what I have to say. Look, I think I'm not going to say anything complicated. It's going to be clearly understandable. If you can convey this objectively to your viewers, your audience, then I'll be very grateful to you. The United States has announced that Russia is its enemy, its adversary. The Congress did that in 2017. U.S. legislation has a provision. That provision says that the U.S. needs to support the rules and the order of democratic administration in our country, and needs to support political organizations. That is enshrined in American law, the U.S. law. Now let's ask a question. If Russia is an enemy, then what organizations will support America in Russia? I don't think the ones that are strengthening the Russian Federation will do that. I think it's going to be those who are restraining it. And that is the objective of the United States, publicly stated objective. Organizing people who are promoting the implementation of Russian policy, of American policy toward Russia, rather. And how should we feel about that? I think it's clear that we should be cautious about it, but we are going to act exclusively within the confines of Russian law.
Дайте Павлу Зарубину микрофон, а потом на RT вернемся.
Let's give Mr. Rubin, we'll give Mr. Zarubin the microphone, then we'll continue with RT. We have heard that the American side has constantly had some rhetoric about political prisoners in Russia, the issue of Navalny. Was that discussed in your discussions with Navalny, and how was it with Biden, and if it was discussed, and how was it discussed? Also, we've all seen that there's a new stage in Russia, American relations with President Biden, and all of this started off with a very crude remark by Biden about you. What do you think? President Biden spoke about human rights. He talked about people dealing with that in the Russian Federation. We talked about that upon his initiative. That's number one. And then as for the improper statements, well, we all know about those statements. After that, President Biden called me, and we cleared things up. And his explanation was good enough for me. And he proposed that we meet in Geneva. That was his initiative. We met. I'd like to repeat that the talks were very constructive. Personally, I was convinced that President Biden is an experienced person, and it's clear that we spoke face-to-face for almost 2 hours. It doesn't happen with all leaders that you have such a detailed conversation face-to-face. As for various accusations, his predecessor was asked the same question. He didn't answer, and this president was asked the same question, and his answer was different than the answer given by President Trump. You know what? In principle, everything that's happening in our countries, in one way or another, is something that the political leadership takes responsibility for, and the people that are, number one, people in charge. As far as who's in charge, who's a murderer, in American cities, every day people are killed. That includes the leaders of various organizations. And you can't say a word about it. You don't have time to say a word and somebody's killed. I remember that somebody ran away and was shot in the back, for example. But fine, those are criminal matters. But what about Afghanistan? Over 100 people were killed at one time. Well, let's say it was a mistake. Well, that happens too. From drones or helicopters. Clearly civilians were killed in Iraq. What is that? And who takes the responsibility for that? Who's the killer? Or for human rights? Listen, well, Guantanamo is still operating now. It's not in accordance with anything, not international law, not American law, not anything. But it still exists. Prisons. Prisons that were open in various countries, including in European countries, for where torture was applied. What is that? Is that human rights? I don't think so. There's hardly anybody sitting in this hall today that would agree that that is protecting human rights. That's already a practice. That's real policy. And based on these practices, we understand that this is done and has continued to be done. It's being done by people who are getting money from abroad. There's some people getting money from abroad in order to further the interests of the people who are paying them. Let's continue. RT, please. One question about the Arctic. You said you talked about that. For a long time, the U.S. has accused Russia of militarizing the Arctic. We heard from Secretary of State Blinken about that in May, about concerns of the Russian military. What did you talk about? We actively discussed that in depth, in pretty big detail. That's a very important and interesting question. As for the Arctic all by itself, in the Northern Passage specifically, is extremely interesting for a number of countries, economically speaking. As for the concerns of the militarization of Americans about the militarization of the Arctic, they are completely unfounded. We're not doing anything that wasn't happening during the Soviet Union. We are establishing an infrastructure that was destroyed. Yes, we're doing that at the modern level. It includes military and border infrastructure, and also conservation infrastructure. We are creating bases for our disaster relief services in order to save people in the sea, if it comes to that, God forbid, and also to protect the environment. What I told our colleagues was that I don't see any concerns. Quite the contrary. I'm firmly convinced that we can cooperate, and we should cooperate in this area. Russia and the United States are one of the 8 members of the Arctic Council. Russia is chairing that, the Arctic Council this year. Moreover, between Alaska and Chukhotsk, there is a strait. It's a well-known strait. On the one end is Russia, and the other end is the United States. All of this should spur us to join our efforts. The situation regarding the use of the Northern Passage is governed by international law, by 2 basic laws: the Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1982, I believe it is, and the Polar Code of Conduct, which consists of a number of documents which were ratified in 2017. I pointed out something to our partners, namely we, Russia, we intend to fully adhere to these international legal standards. We're not violating anything. We are prepared to assist all stakeholders and all companies in exploring the Northern Passage. Due to climate change, this situation is changing. And we also have new ice-breaking ships. They're the most powerful in the world in Russia. That's why we definitely need to work in this area. The Convention on the Law of the Sea, I'll recall, was drawn up because it describes the legal regime, specifically in internal seas, in territorial seas, in seas that belong to a country, exclusive economic areas, and the free open seas. Internal seas, those are the seas that are within the territory of a country. Then you have the territorial waters, 12 sea miles. And then you have other categories. In the territorial seas, the military ships can go. As far as the internal seas, there's a particular regime, and we're not imposing anything on anybody there. In internal seas, just so you know, I believe there are 5: the Omsk Sea, the Aniseisk Gulf, etc. There are 5 total, 5 gulfs or bays, maybe they're called. There are almost 1,000 nautical miles. This is our sovereign right to either let ships go through there or not, but we're not abusing this rule. We're providing it to anybody who wants. There were around 1,000 applications last year, I think. And some of the ships are under Russian flags. And our regulatory authorities monitor compliance with the Polar Code of Conduct, which has requirements for ships. If all of us together, all stakeholder countries, including the member of the Arctic Council, if all of us are interested in tackling these issues, there are some areas where we need to continue to work. I'm convinced that we can find an answer. I don't see any problems that we cannot tackle. All right, in TV, please. Good afternoon, Mr. Putin. Good relations, or at least not poor relations, between Russia and America were always the guarantor of calm international relations. And you talked with Biden. Biden agreed on some matters. Now you're talking about respect. You said that your talks were characterized by that. Before the talks, you talked about red lines. And Americans have some red lines. During the talks, were you able to reach an agreement about not crossing the red lines in all areas? Is that something that would improve the relations or at least stabilize the relations? Well, I can say that on the whole, we understand what our American partners are saying. They understood what we were saying. I mean, when we're talking about red lines. But I have to be frank. Of course, we didn't get to the point where we were talking in depth about where the line would be drawn. We talked about work on cybersecurity. We talked about strategic stability. I think that during these consultations, incidentally, also all of this should be discussed, and I hope that we can agree upon it. I'm including the Arctic matters in that too. ABC News, our American branch.
Mr. President, thank you so much for taking my question. President Biden has said that he would respond if cyber attacks from Russia do not stop. I'm curious, what did he tell you? Did he make any threats? And a quick follow-up, if I may, sir. The list of your political opponents who are dead, imprisoned, or jailed is long. Alexei Navalny's organization calls for free and fair elections, an end to corruption. But Russia has outlawed that organization, calling it extremist. And you have now prevented anyone who supports him to run for office. So my question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Okay. Once more, let me reiterate what was already said about various so-called foreign agents and about people who are positioning themselves as the non-systemic opposition. I already answered your colleague from CNN, right? But this is the law of the genre, so I have to answer your question, please. I'll do it again. The United States has adopted a law in accordance with which the U.S. has said that they will support various political organizations in Russia. At the same time, they made an announcement that the Russian Federation is an enemy. They've spoken publicly, saying that they will restrain the development of Russia. Here's a question. What organizations, what political organizations of the United States and other members of the Western community, which organizations should be supported in Russia, especially if they're paying for them? We're just like the Americans the way the Americans did back in the 1930s. We're calling them foreign agents. But it's not prohibited. They're not prohibited from working. They can continue to operate. Foreign agents don't need to stop operating. If they are extremist in nature, then that's another issue. The organization that you mentioned has publicly called for a mass disorder. They have publicly called for breaking the law, that called for minors to participate in activities that were against the law, and they were talking about using Molotov cocktails against the authorities as well, including against police. America just recently had very severe events after well-known events after a killing of an African American. And an entire movement developed known as Black Lives Matter. I'm not going to comment on that, but here's what I do want to say. What we saw was disorder, destruction, violations of the law, etc. We feel sympathy for the United States of America, but we don't want that to happen on our territory. And we're doing our utmost in order to not allow it to happen. And some fears that has nothing to do with anything. Please. Could you give me the microphone, please?
You didn't answer my question, sir. If all of your political opponents are dead, in prison, poisoned, doesn't that send a message that you do not want a fair political fight?
As for who is killing whom or throwing whom in jail, people came to the U.S. Congress with political demands. 400 people. Over 400 people had criminal charges placed on them. They faced prison sentences of up to 20, maybe even 25 years. They're being called domestic terrorists. They're being accused of a number of other crimes. 70 of them were arrested right away after the events, and 30 of them are still under arrest. It's unclear on what grounds. And as for nobody from the official authorities has informed us about it. Some people died, and one of the people that died, they were simply shot on the spot by the police, although they were not threatening the police with any weapons. In many countries, the same thing happens in our country. I'd like to stress once more that we sympathize with what happened in the United States, but we have no desire to allow the same thing to happen in our country. Just a couple of more questions, because later the President will continue his program. Please hand over the microphone. I'm from Izvestia. Were you able to reach an agreement on returning some of the Russians that ended up in American prisons? If yes, then when will it happen? We talked about it. President Biden raised that question. The question about American citizens that were in Russian prisons. We discussed that. There could be some compromise that we enter into between the Russian Foreign Ministry and the U.S. State Department. They will be working on it. The Russia channel. Russia 1. You said that you discussed trade with Mr. Biden. That's probably the most positive agenda. Business from both ends are interested in development. What are the prospects that you see here? Thank you. This doesn't depend on us. It depends on the Americans. We haven't leveled any restrictions. What I think is after some restrictions were introduced in the economy and in commerce, I think that was done much more by the U.S. than by Russia. Yes, this did affect some of our development. The U.S. is carrying out their task of restraining Russia, but they didn't have any critical effect. That's number one. Number two, this has to do with the interests of American businesses. 200 people, the biggest delegation of Americans. It was an American delegation. That delegation was at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. Some restrictions were introduced, including for American companies. Due to that, some of the American companies have lost out. They've given up the business into the hands of their competitors from other countries. We talked about that. What for? There's no practical reason, but there are losses. As for our trade with the U.S., I think it's $28 billion, roughly, in the first. It increased by 16% in the first quarter of this year. If this trend continues, I think that will be a benefit for everybody. Sure. You know what? Let's have a couple of questions from here and a couple of questions from here. All right. The lady here, please. Andrei, let the lady answer. Ask a question. Maybe. Mr. President, thank you very much for affording me the opportunity to ask you a question. A few years ago, you met President Biden. That was when he was vice president. What he said was that he looked you in the eye, and he said that he didn't see a soul. And you said, that means we understand one another. Did you, tell me please, did you look him in the eye and what did you see there? Did you see a person with whom you can work? And please tell me, President Biden, did he invite you to visit the Russian White House? And if the White House rather, and if yes, did you agree to go to the White House? President Biden did not invite me as his guest. I didn't invite him either. I think for visits like that, for meetings like that, you need to have the proper conditions. You need to be ready. As for the soul, seeing it or not seeing something, well, this isn't the first time I've heard this. Frankly speaking, I don't recall this conversation, but I will allow that it happened and it escaped my attention. But if you ask me what sort of a partner, what sort of a conversational partner Biden is, I'd say he's very constructive, he's very balanced, just the way that I expected. He's very experienced, you can tell that at first glance. But he talked about his family, recalling them. He talked about what his mom said. You know, these are important things. They're not directly related to any matters directly, but it shows the extent of his moral values, and that's all quite attractive. And what I think is, on the whole, we spoke the same language. That doesn't mean that we necessarily have to look into our eyes, look into our souls. We need to have eternal friendship and love, but no, we have to represent our countries, and the relationship is a pragmatic one, primarily. Yes, please. Andrei Kolesnikov from Kommersant, the newspaper. Mr. Putin, based on the outcome of this meeting, did you have any new, are there any new illusions? Well, I didn't have any old illusions. What about new ones? No illusions, there are no illusions, and there could not be any illusions. Okay, over here, you're raising your hand. Yeah, please. Give her the microphone. The young lady can decide herself whom to give the microphone to. Hello, I'm from the channel Zvezda. Mr. Putin, a question about global climate change. Did you speak with President Biden about that? And the second question has to do with American media. Recently, you gave a big interview to NBC. Do you think that it is fair to give the American president's do you think it's fair to give an interview to the American media when it doesn't happen the other way around? And how do you feel about having your words always being distorted? You know what, about the distortion or about silencing things? Well, that is the practice in international relations today. What can you do? Can't do anything about it. We've gotten used to that a long time ago, and we're all living with it. We've been living with it for decades. As for who's giving an interview, that decision is taken by the relevant leaders or countries. And if you want to convey something in addition to people, then, well, we try to do that. I gave an interview to the American press, and that's exactly what I was trying to do there. As for the activities of our mass media in general, for example, President Biden raised a question about freedom, about the freedom of Europe and Russia, I think, or rather Radio Free Europe, which we called a foreign agent. Biden broached that. Before that, there were other media outlets. There's also Sputnik, a media outlet working abroad. And before that, the United States called Sputnik a foreign agent. And what we did in response. What we did with regard to the Voice of America. And this is done in accordance with the law, registration, etc. And a lot of problems have been created for our personnel with money transfers and that sort of thing. We don't have that kind of a problem. And for American medias, the American media hasn't complied with all of the requirements of Russian law. I think that even here we can work through the ministries of foreign affairs to resolve matters. Let's go over here, sure. Okay, I was referring to the lady there. But sure, yeah, you can go next. Thank you very much. Galina Polonska from Euronews. Galina Polonska, Euronews. We all saw you shake Joe Biden's hand at the very beginning. Here's my question. Were you able to bring mutual understanding and trust to a different level with the President of the United States? Do you think it's realistic at this juncture to have a new level of relations when where they're absolutely clear and transparent, and where there'll be an understanding of where both countries need to go to? Let me tell you, in life, there is no happiness, there's only the specter of happiness. I think in this situation, there's not like family-based trust, but I think that there was some specter of trust that we caught a glimpse of. Please, the microphone. You already have a microphone, or you want a second one, huh? This one wasn't turned on. Thank you. The coronavirus is one of the most important issues on the planet now. Was this issue discussed with the American president? And if yes, what are the prospects for joint work with the Americans in order to curb this plague? And perhaps you've talked about mutual recognition of vaccines. We did talk about that, but we only touched on it tangentially. We answered a request by the Americans to send our equipment as humanitarian assistance. You know, America is a big, powerful country. And it's not like they don't have money. Just at that point, they really needed our equipment. And we did it free of charge. And we're prepared to continue cooperation on these lines in the future, but we didn't talk about it in general. We didn't talk about it in detail, rather, today. With regard to President Trump, after those meetings, the relations between the two countries deteriorated further. Is there any indication that that won't happen again? Did we reach in our relationship with the U.S. some sort of a low point that we can push off from and go up? That's difficult to say now. That's because all of the activities that have to do with worsening the relations, all of the actions that did that were not initiated by us. I don't know. Please. Alexander Ganov, Komsomolskaya Pravda. I'm not sure if you know, but our team won. Congratulations. So what do you think is the score in the Putin-Biden meeting? And the second question. The Americans, before coming to Geneva, they kept on saying, we're going to put pressure on Putin, we're going to put pressure on Russia. Did you feel that pressure? Was there any conflict? That's probably the most important question that Russia's interested in. That's it, I think. Another thing. You know, well, I think that's pretty much enough. I think so too. We didn't experience any pressure, although there was a candid and open conversation, and there were no personal or diplomatic deviations from the topics we set out to address. So let me repeat once more. There was no pressure from either side. It would be senseless to do that, too. That's not the reason why people meet each other. What was the first part of your question? Oh, the score. Well, I think before our meeting, President Biden said that it wasn't a sporting event, and I fully agree with that. What's the point of keeping score? The meeting had results. It was substantive. It was concrete. And it took place in an atmosphere that was geared toward achieving results. First and foremost, the specter of trust that our colleague from Yavor News talked about. Please, BBC News, go ahead. Thank you.
Rosenberg, BBC News. Vladimir Vladimirovich, Joe Biden призывает за стабильные, предсказуемые отношения с Россией.
Stable, predictable relations with Russia. But on the West, it's believed that the unpredictability is a feature of Russian foreign policy. Are you prepared to renounce unpredictability for the sake of improving relations with the West? Thank you. I envy you for the level of artistry you've achieved here. So, turning to the first, as for the first question, do you think, and then the second question, are you, the first question, the West considers, and secondly, are you prepared to renounce it? Just because the West believes that to be the case, it doesn't mean that it is the case. Let's turn to the first part of the question. You said that the West believes that Russia's foreign policy is unpredictable. Let me answer that. When the U.S. exited the ABM treaty for no reason, why did they do that? That had an effect on strategic stability, and now the withdrawal from the INF in 2012. What's stable about that? There's nothing stable about that at all. Withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty. What's stable there? There's practically nothing left. But luckily, Joe Biden is addressing the area of strategic stability. He has made quite a sound decision to extend the START treaty. Well, let's take the situation surrounding Ukraine and Crimea. Everybody's dancing around that, right? What is stable about the fact that a state coup d'etat was organized in Ukraine when President Yanukovych agreed with all of the demands of the opposition? He was prepared, in essence, to leave power and to hold new elections. No. There was a need to carry out a bloody coup d'etat, which led to results that are well known, and well known in East Ukraine. And you think that we're unpredictable? No, I don't think so. In my view, we are acting absolutely appropriately to counter threats that are emerging against us. And I think for the situation to be truly stable, we need to reach an agreement on proper rules of conduct in all the areas that we talked about: strategic stability, cybersecurity, tackling issues that have to do with regional conflicts. I think that we can reach an agreement on everything. At least today, the impression arose, that impression arose based on the outcome of our meeting, my meeting with Mr. Biden. What? Are we going to start singing songs now? Blue fog, deceit. Well, now our foreign colleagues aren't going to understand that reference. Okay, let's give the floor to one of the foreign outlets, Bloomberg, please. I have a follow-up question.
Bloomberg News или архивов? Владимир Владимирович.
Bloomberg News. Mr. Putin, in 2016 you met with Trump. After that, American sanctions were adopted. Well, the latest round were adopted very quickly. Did you talk with Joe Biden about the guarantees that you would have for these sanctions to be lifted, or rather for new sanctions not to be introduced against Russia? And you said that there's some incipient hope. With regard to Biden, you mentioned some initial agreements. Do you have more trust that he'll be able to do it? Because it's believed that the American administration has more solidarity with the American president than was the case during Donald Trump's term. You talked about cybersecurity. You had consultations on Ukraine. I wasn't sure, was there a working group on cybersecurity? And you talked about some red lines. Did you lay out the red lines specifically about that? Can you tell us about that? Well, let's turn to the red lines. I've already addressed that many times. The understanding arises during negotiations on key areas of our interaction. It makes no sense to try to scare one another. When people sit down at the negotiating table in order to establish relations, not to intimidate each other. As for these sanctions, as for restrictions on economies, I've already said. We don't know what the mood, what the domestic policy mood is like over there. We know the general situation, but we can't say what's happening in detail. So there's some who are against Russian development. There's some who are proponents of it. It's difficult to say which side is prevailing. But if after our meeting some steps are taken, the ones that you recalled in 2016, then what will that mean? That will mean that we've lost the latest opportunity. Please. One final question from a journalist from Canada.
You said to a couple of my colleagues you wanted unbiased. Do you have a translation?
No.
Do you hear me now?
No.
По-русски?
Не хотят Канаду включить.
Yeah, they didn't want
Хорошо?
to.
Нет перевода.
There's no interpretation. I can't hear it.
I will try and repeat.
Сейчас, может, на другой канал перейдут. Попробуйте.
Maybe you will try on a different channel.
Да? Нет, я не слышу ничего. Вообще ничего.
I can't hear anything. I don't hear anything whatsoever.
Сейчас, секундочку.
1 second.
Извините, пожалуйста.
Хорошо?
Есть звук. Повторите, пожалуйста, сначала.
Thank you.
Sorry, please, if you wouldn't mind repeating.
Tamara Altaresco from Radio Canada in Moscow. You said to a couple of my colleagues you wanted unbiased, fair questions and coverage. I have a fair question for you. It actually comes from my 9-year-old daughter, who asked me before I left to come here, what is the big deal with this summit? And it's quite a complicated answer for a 9-year-old. So I'd like you to explain to us, in your own words, Mr. President, why is this relationship so complicated? And also, she'd like to know, and I'd like to know, why are young people not allowed to protest in Russia?
Yes, that's great. It's great that your 9-year-old daughter is interested in these questions. The answer is very simple. You need to look around yourself. You need to see how beautiful the world is. And adults, the leaders of 2 countries, the biggest nuclear powers, are meeting. They're doing that in order to make the world safer, more reliable, and a place for everyone, a home for everyone to flourish, for all those who live on our planet. And they're doing that, they're addressing issues that have to do with a terrible weapon, which needs to be limited. They need to draw up common rules on refraining from using those weapons. They talked about protecting the environment, about rivers being clean, about seas being clean, about there not being any floods, not being any droughts, about providing food to everyone on the planet, no matter where they are. They'll talk about issues of healthcare, so that when children grow up, they get sick less often, they have the opportunity to study, and they have the opportunity to look at the future confidently. And I hope that at our meeting, I hope that you will cover our meeting based on those considerations in particular. I thank you for your attention. All the best.